Welcome to Module 8. In this module, we will review functional behavior assessments. Once you have selected and operationally defined a target behavior, the next step is to conduct a functional behavior assessment. We sometimes refer to functional behavior assessments as an FBA. The purpose of a functional behavior assessment is twofold. First, it allows us to document the need for an intervention. Second, it identifies the cause or reason for a problem behavior. Remember the ABC model of behavior? The goal of an FBA is to identify the antecedents and consequences that control the problem behavior. There are three types of functional behavior assessment that can be used. Indirect assessment, which relies on verbal reports such as questionnaires or rating scales. Direct assessment, which involves the observation of behavior in the natural environment. And functional analysis, also called experimental analysis. It's a specific type of functional behavior assessment which consists of manipulating the variables suspected of controlling problem behavior. The goal of those three types of assessment is to identify the antecedents and consequences associated with the problem behavior. We will first describe indirect assessments. Indirect assessments involve administering interviews, questionnaires, or rating scales to the individual's caregivers, parents, teachers, or therapists. This type of assessment is called indirect because it's based on verbal reports and does not require direct contact with the problem behavior. Examples of questions that can be asked to help determine what is maintaining problem behavior using a direct assessment are: what does the problem behavior look like? When and where is it most likely to occur? What people or materials are usually present? What happens just before the behavior? And what usually happens just after the behavior? Several interview forms have been developed to assess the antecedents and consequences related to problem behavior. A few examples of these are the Functional Analysis Screening Tool, the Motivational Assessment Scale, the Functional Assessment Checklist for Teachers and Staff, the Functional Assessment Interview, and questions about behavioral function. The Functional Analysis Screening Tool, or FAST, is a one-page interview that is administered to the caregivers that interact with the individual most frequently. It contains 16 yes or no questions. It asks caregivers to describe problem behavior, its frequency, as well as its severity. The questions attempt to identify the main functions of behavior: attention, escape, or sensory reinforcement, otherwise known as automatic reinforcement. Examples of questions on the FAST are whether the problem behavior occurs when the person is not receiving attention, or when the person is asked to perform a task, do they exhibit problem behavior? Or if asked to participate in an activity, is problem behavior evoked? To score the FAST, one can simply count the number of questions that were answered yes for each function. The function with the highest score is considered to be the one that maintains the problem behavior. For example, if the informant answered yes to most of the questions regarding the escape function, then this function is likely to be the one that maintains problem behavior. The Functional Assessment Checklist for Teachers and Staff, or FACTS, is a semi-structured interview developed for school personnel that can be administered to teachers, parents, or clinicians. It is helpful in designing a behavior support plan or could be used as part of a more complete functional behavior assessment. Completion of the interview allows one to develop a summary statement about the function of behavior. In order to complete the FACTS, informants are asked to precisely describe the problem behavior as well as its antecedents and possible consequences. The Motivational Assessment Scale, or MAS, includes 16 questions relating to the main functions of behavior, such as attention, escape, tangible, or automatic reinforcement. Here, informants are asked to describe the behavior using a rating scale with frequency descriptors ranging from never to always. Indirect assessment for problem behavior is usually fast and fairly easy to conduct. However, the heavy reliance on memory and verbal report sacrifices accuracy. While it is not best practice to rely solely on an indirect assessment, they can be useful as a first step to a more thorough assessment. The descriptive assessment is another type of functional behavior assessment that can be used to assess problem behavior. Descriptive assessments consist of observing the behavior directly in naturally occurring conditions to identify events that are correlated with the problem behavior. Gathering information for descriptive functional assessments consists of collecting data about relevant environmental variables each time the behavior occurs. The most common and useful form of descriptive assessment includes observing and recording the antecedents and consequences of a behavior and the locations and times those behaviors are most likely to occur. This assessment is referred to as the ABC data collection assessment, and two types have been developed, the narrative or the checklist. When recording ABC data, in terms of the antecedent, it's important to record the setting of the problem behavior, so for example, the classroom or the library, maybe the type of activity that is occurring, for example, group instruction or possibly shopping, and the immediate antecedent to the problem behavior, which is whether the person has just been asked to do something, is alone, or is required to transition from one activity to the next. When describing the problem behavior, be sure to be specific. That is, focus on describing the problem behavior of interest. The description of problem behavior should be as precise as possible. For example, saying the child had a tantrum is not precise enough to convey exactly what happened. Describing the tantrum in terms of crying, then falling to the ground, is more precise. Objective description should be used whenever possible, as opposed to subjective description, such as saying that the child is angry, frustrated, or controlling. In order to use objective language, you may want to say that the student was crying, exhibited yelling behavior, or exhibited verbal protest. Another example would be if a student is engaged in laughing, that may be more precise and objective than saying that the student thought that something was funny. Describing the consequences of the behavior consists of describing what other people did in the environment, or what the behavior produced in the environment. Did an adult teacher say or do something, such as redirect the behavior, move closer or away from the person, or remove the child from the location? If other people are present, such as peers, record what their reactions were as well. For example, did they laugh, or did a peer cry? Did the peer move closer or move further away? Describing consequences precisely is important to help identify the function of behavior. Basically, you want to objectively describe the effect the behavior had on the environment. Narrative ABC recording is a form of unstructured data collection that is open-ended. Every time the problem behavior occurs, the observer writes a brief description of the behavior, as well as the antecedents and consequences that occurred before and after the behavior. Here's an example of a datasheet commonly used for ABC narrative recording. It has a column for the time that the behavior occurred, the setting or activity in which the behavior occurred, as well as a brief description of the behavior that occurred and its antecedents and consequences. Another type of descriptive assessment is a more structured version of the ABC recording. It's an ABC checklist recording. In this case, each column of the form lists possible problem behaviors, antecedents, and consequences. The observer then records the occurrence of each by putting a check mark to the one that applies. There are many ways to design ABC checklists. This is just a sample checklist describing a few categories for antecedents and a few for consequences. Every time the problem behavior occurs, a check mark is put in the corresponding column for both antecedents and consequences. You may also want to briefly describe the behavior that occurred. ABC checklists can vary in terms of complexity depending on the types of conditions that an individual is exposed to. Each antecedent and consequence defined on the ABC checklist can be categorized to the type of function they serve. For example, presenting a demand and removing a demand are both antecedents and consequences that are typically associated with escape from an activity. ABC checklists allow observers to target specific information about what happens before and after problem behavior. They also allow for more objective information than narrative. Narrative recording is typically more time-consuming and can lead to errors in interpretation. To summarize, information from descriptive assessments allow us to collect information that is more accurate, since it does not rely on recall and interpretation like one might see when conducting interviews. However, keep in mind that descriptive assessments of problem behavior only produce correlational data, and some of the environmental variables that are associated with the occurrence of problem behavior might not have a causal role. When the environment is complex, this type of assessment might yield inconclusive results. When you are collecting ABC data, be sure to use an operational definition of behavior, observe in a variety of settings and at different times, as well as observe the individual in situations where demands are placed or attention is infrequent. When analyzing ABC data, it's important to look for patterns. So, what usually happens before the behavior? What usually happens after the behavior? When, where, and with whom does the behavior most often occur? For example, if the most common antecedent is a lack of attention, and the most common consequence is that the learner receives attention, and all other consequences occur at relatively low levels, then the function is most likely attention. If the common antecedent is that the individual is given an instruction, and then the problem behavior leads to the removal of the demand, then the function is likely escape. If the most common antecedent is that no attention or instructions are given, and little access to preferred items is provided, then it is possible that the problem behavior is maintained by automatic reinforcement, if the problem behavior does not produce any attention, instruction, or access to preferred items after it has occurred. To analyze ABC data, you can tally the occurrences of problem behavior for each antecedent and for each consequence separately. In this example, we can see that problem behavior occurred most often when there was low attention in the environment before the problem behavior. As a result of that problem behavior, attention was delivered the majority of the time. In this case, access to attention seems to be the main function for the problem behavior. When analyzing ABC data, be sure to count antecedents and consequences for each problem behavior separately, as different behaviors can serve different functions. Graphing the percentage or number of times the behavior occurs for each type of antecedent and consequence is another way to see which of them are correlated with the problem behavior. In this example, we can see that hitting occurs most often when the individual is asked to stop a preferred activity or is denied a request. Data from the consequence graph allows us to see that problem behavior is usually followed by the possibility to resume the activity or being given access to the item that was originally denied. In this case, access to tangibles seems to be the likely maintaining function of the behavior. Completing an FBA allows us to formulate a hypothesis about what is maintaining the problem behavior. A hypothesis regarding the problem behavior consists in formulating a general statement describing what antecedents are suspected to trigger the behavior, the topography of the behavior, and the consequence that is suspected to maintain the behavior. Writing the hypothesis statement in ABC format is useful because it suggests possible avenues for antecedent and consequence-based interventions. An example hypothesis statement is that when presented with math exercises, the student generally hits their head, which is followed by the termination of the math activity and the student is allowed to take a break. Based on this, the function of the behavior is most likely escape. A third type of functional behavior assessment is the functional analysis. It is also called the experimental analysis, where individuals are exposed to variables that are suspected to maintain problem behavior, and those variables are then carefully manipulated in order to identify which is actually maintaining problem behavior. Conducting a functional analysis of the problem behavior allows us to identify the cause of the behavior by systematically manipulating the antecedents and consequences of that behavior, rather than just by describing or observing them. Functional analyses are similar to allergy tests. Those are used to identify which food or substance causes an allergic reaction. In terms of functional analysis, we use systematic manipulations in the environment to identify what antecedents evoke problem behavior and what consequences likely maintain problem behavior. The basic components of running a functional analysis of problem behavior involves exposing the individual to control and test conditions where antecedents and consequences are manipulated. The control condition is designed so that the individual has no motivation to engage in problem behavior. The test condition involves manipulating antecedents and consequences to see which one is likely to cause the problem behavior. Comparing the level of problem behavior in the test conditions to the control conditions allows us to determine which variable is responsible for the occurrence of problem behavior. For very severe problem behavior, or dangerous problem behavior, conducting a formal functional analysis designed and directed by a qualified professional such as a BCBA is highly recommended. However, for less serious problem behaviors, professionals with training in applied behavior analysis can test the hypotheses that they've formulated through indirect assessment and direct observations by systematically manipulating the antecedents and consequences of problem behavior. For severe or dangerous problem behavior, we recommend that qualified board-certified behavior analysts be the ones who design and direct formal functional analyses. However, we would like to quickly describe some of the components so you're familiar with the general structure of the functional analysis. Conducting a standard functional analysis, first described by Iwata in 1984, generally involves exposing the individual to specific contexts or conditions. For example, one condition consists of delivering attention following problem behavior, while another will allow escape from demands following problem behavior. In the control condition, rich attention and desired activities are presented along with no demands to the individual. The goal of the functional analysis is to compare rates or frequency of problem behavior in the control condition to those in the test conditions. If problem behavior is much higher in attention than all other conditions, then we can say that attention is the maintaining variable for problem behavior. In the play condition or control condition, attention is given, preferred toys or leisure items and activities are made available, and no demands are presented. This is targeting low levels of problem behavior and attempting to reduce the motivation associated with problem behavior. In the attention condition, no attention is delivered to the individual participating in the functional analysis. If problem behavior does occur during the session, the therapist provides high-quality attention in order to see if that functions as a reinforcer for the problem behavior. In the escape condition, the participant is presented with constant demands. These demands are usually fairly difficult and can often evoke problem behavior. If problem behavior does occur during the escape condition, the demand is removed for a short period of time. In the tangible condition, preferred items are taken away from the individual participating in the functional analysis. If problem behavior were to occur in the tangible condition, that preferred item would be delivered to that individual for a short period of time. In the alone condition, the participant is left alone in a room to understand if the problem behavior persists in the absence of social interaction. For less severe problem behavior, it is possible for people with training in applied behavior analysis to make systematic manipulations to the environment in order to gain a better understanding of the variables that control problem behavior. Once you have formulated a hypothesis based on descriptive or indirect assessment, it can be useful to systematically manipulate antecedents and consequences in order to see what evokes problem behavior and what likely maintains problem behavior. To test your hypothesis that you have formulated, first develop a control condition where the individual should have no motivation to engage in problem behavior. This is where you may have lots of attention, preferred activities, or no demands provided. Next, create a test condition where you will create motivation to engage in that problem behavior. In this condition, manipulate the antecedents and consequences directly related to your hypothesis. For example, if you hypothesize that problem behavior is maintained by escape from academic tasks, start by providing a difficult academic task. If problem behavior occurs, remove the task and see if problem behavior ceases. Run these conditions for about 1 to 2 minutes each time, or until problem behavior occurs. And be sure to run them at relevant times or during relevant activities throughout the day. Here's another example. Based on interviews and observation, you hypothesize that when in group instruction, an individual does not receive a whole lot of attention. The student often bites his hand, which is typically followed by an adult asking him to stop while patting his back. The hypothesized function of the problem behavior in this case is to get attention. In this example, our control condition would likely consist of giving high-quality attention frequently to the individual and seeing if problem behavior occurs during that condition. Likely, if they're provided with high-quality attention frequently, it won't occur. What we will then do in the test condition is remove that high-quality attention and see if problem behavior occurs. If problem behavior occurs during that condition, we'll reinforce with attention, and we'll understand if problem behavior is actually maintained by that attention or not. Systematically manipulating consequences and antecedents through the use of a functional analysis allows us to identify the cause of the problem behavior in a more precise manner. However, it can sometimes be difficult to isolate relevant variables in certain settings, such as schools. You will need to keep in mind that to run a formal functional analysis for severe problem behaviors or severe dangerous behaviors, supervision by qualified professionals like a board-certified behavior analyst is highly recommended. Systematically manipulating consequences and antecedents through the use of a functional analysis allows us to identify the cause of the problem behavior in a more precise manner. However, it can sometimes be difficult to isolate relevant variables in certain settings, such as schools. You will need to keep in mind that to run a formal functional analysis for severe problem behaviors or severe dangerous behaviors, supervision by qualified professionals like a board-certified behavior analyst is highly recommended. The functional behavior assessment is considered complete once you have reliably identified and documented antecedents and consequences responsible for the problem behavior, formulated a hypothesis about the variables responsible for the occurrence of that problem behavior, and have data from direct observation or hypothesis testing to support that hypothesis you've developed. While conducting a functional behavior assessment appears to be time-consuming and may possibly delay intervention, it is likely to result in an intervention that will produce much faster reductions in problem behavior. Furthermore, it allows us to identify reinforcers that are maintaining problem behavior, and how those can be manipulated during the intervention. Finally, using a function-matched intervention is more likely to create long-term improvement of that individual's behavior. Once you have operationally defined the behavior of interest, completing a functional behavior assessment allows you to develop a more efficient and effective intervention. 3 types of assessment are useful: indirect assessment, which involves interviewing caregivers; descriptive assessment, which involves observing the behavior when it is occurring; and functional analysis, which involves consistently and systematically manipulating the variables controlling the behavior. All those assessments involve isolating the antecedent and consequences responsible for the occurrence of the problem behavior. Interventions can then be based on the modification of those variables in order to decrease the problem behavior and teach a replacement behavior.